Hi everybody. Okay, so we're still here at the Panguitch Quilt Show, but I wanted to give you guys a little bit more background on these quilts and why the quilt shows are so special, and why Panguitch is extra special because of their quilts, and why it's called the Panguitch Quilt Walk and not a quilt show. So a lot of them were immigrants to the country. It was in the 1800s when they came across the plains, and they came from other countries. They came from the east all the way across to the west, and it wasn't easy. They traveled in wagons and hand carts, and their quilts were really important to them. They helped keep them warm, and they wasted nothing. A lot of their quilts were made from clothing that had worn out. And so as their shirts and things would wear out, they would cut them up and turn them into these beautiful works of art. And a lot of them were small pieces like the one behind me. And it's a lot of work that goes into this, hours and hours. And if you can imagine, the cute stitching behind me is done by a machine. Back in those days, it would have all been done by hand. But it's what kept them warm. And to me, quilts are super special. My grandma Dorothy quilted a lot, and so did her whole community. And they would get together and they would quilt these beautiful quilts for all the girls that were getting married, and it was a lot of love put into them, and the people appreciated them. And so it was just a treasured thing that has been passed down, carried on. It's like a tradition. So I wanted to tell you the special story of Panguitch while I walk you around this quilt show just a little bit, and why the Panguitch area is so special. So I will show you these quilts while I talk about it. So here in Panguitch, Utah, it's more southern. In the northern part of Utah, there's huge mountain range. But there are here too. In some places they're really big, and in other places it's kind of flat. The Panguitch area is set along the Sevier River, and they mean it. To live here in this area, it's very severe. It's very desert, it's very hot. And in the winter, it's very cold and very snowy. And so it's severe on both counts. So back in the 1800s, they had traveled to this area to help settle it. And they had come over from Parowan, Utah, into Panguitch. And at the time, it was called Fairview, not Panguitch. And so they had traveled over here to settle the area. Unfortunately for them, they had a bad harvest. They had planted things and it just didn't grow very good the first year. And they had provisions, but not enough to support the town. They had quite a few people that lived here, and it wasn't just adults, it was a lot of children. A lot of children crossed these hard areas and came west. So as they were trying to support their families and stuff with a bad harvest, as winter set in with the horrible snow, they became very, very hungry by January. They ran out of food. And they had immature wheat that couldn't be made into bread. It couldn't be ground. It could be mushed and boiled, but that is not terribly awesome. It doesn't taste great. And they had sacks of potatoes, but if they ate the potatoes, they wouldn't be able to seed and plant them the next year. So they were starving to death and really having a hard time. And they were also having a hard time because the Indians were also rising up and causing problems because they were hungry too. And so the town met, and they decided that 7 men would go towards Parowan to try and get some provisions. There was other groups that also went in other directions to try and make it out. They tried to go to Cedar, which is south, and then they also tried to go to a town that was 100 miles north. But the snow was so deep that they were up to their waist in it. So these other groups that had set off had to turn back. They felt like they couldn't go any further. This is handwork. They felt like they couldn't go any further. So of the other groups that had taken off, they came back. But the 7 men that went towards Parowan knew that they just couldn't give up, and they kept pressing forward. But the snow was so deep and it was so cold, and they were weakened from hunger, that they got really discouraged, and they cut the animals free, sent them back home, and abandoned the carts and left them there, and kept trudging through the snow. And it was up to their waist, and they were freezing cold, wet, weak from hunger. And so they only took their quilts with them to help try to keep them warm while they were walking. Well, one of them threw the quilt on the ground, and they all 7 men came and knelt to pray on that quilt to find out what to do. They just were besides themselves and couldn't figure out what to do. So they prayed on this quilt, and when they were done, they realized that while they were on this quilt, they didn't sink in the snow. So the 7 men and their 7 quilts laid the quilts on the snow and made a path to walk on. They made it all the way up the huge mountain pass between Panguitch and Parowan, and down the other side. And they made it to Parowan, got all the provisions. These 7 men carried 50-pound bags of grain back with them the whole way, walking along these quilts the whole way back. So not only were they carrying the 50-pound bags of grain, but they were also carrying these quilts. Quilts are not light. They are very heavy. And so they'd lay them in a line, and they'd pick up the one at the end and lay it down in front. And they have a quilt here at this quilt walk. That's why it's called a quilt walk, because the men walked on the quilts. And this quilt is called Quilt Walk, and it depicts the 7 men walking through the snowy mountain pass on the quilts. And then the man at the end would take his quilt and walk it to the front. And the men's names are here represented on this quilt with their hats. And this is why quilting becomes such a passionate joy, because of stories like these.
I'll show you.
This one is very extreme, but many, many families have stories like these, and the quilts to remember them
I
by.
know, they're so fun.
It happened in 1864. They went from Fairview over the mountain range to Parowan. But now Fairview is called Panguitch. So now you know the story about the Panguitch Quilt Walk and why it's such a special and famous show. This quilt walk is over 50 years old, and they have so many people that know about it and that travel here to see these gorgeous quilts on display that people make. And there's a cute play in town that describes the story. So if you ever find your way to Panguitch, which is right on its way to all sorts of other beautiful, wonderful places like Bryce Canyon and Cedar City, stop in. So thank you so much for going on the Panguitch Quilt Walk with me.